Hi folks, thanks for watching this video. If you're not familiar with my channel, my name is Jared. My channel is Wander the Nation's Rage. And I just want to thank you for watching this video. Even if you don't watch my other videos, it's just really important to me for those that have decided to watch this video. And if you watch it, then you'll understand why. I've gone into great detail about my specific testimony, and it's rather lengthy, so I'm just going to go straight into it. I was born on March 20th, 1985. My mother, while carrying me, had 2 ultrasounds. Both times she was told she was having a baby girl. If this were true, I would have been her 3rd daughter. But to everyone's surprise, when I arrived, I made the truth known. The truth is that my mother wanted a boy. In fact, she asked God to bring her a son who would be equipped for the ministry of the gospel. My childhood was rather rocky. My parents' relationship had been spent by the time I was 8 years of age. They split up in 1994 after my father had developed a brain tumor 3 years prior, during which time we had managed to live on his Social Security check. Before my father's illness set in, he wasn't a churchgoer and preferred to live life on his terms. That all changed when he started having seizures at work and received the grim diagnosis, which forced him to undergo immediate brain surgery. I grew up in religion and grew accustomed to the religious principles of the United Pentecostal Church. Though at the time I had love for and feared God, it didn't take long for me to notice the world outside of the church. Having religion oppressively forced upon me as a child, or so at the time was my prerogative on it. I grew up to despise church and dreaded going. This whole perspective is what started the slow drift away from my purpose. I had a lot of trouble getting through school as well. By the time I dropped out at age 15, I had changed schools over 10 times. At 15, I convinced my mother to allow me to get a full-time job. At 16, I was able to purchase my first car. The job had brought me the freedom from church, and the car had allowed an opportunity to experience the outside world. I seem to have had a knack for finding trouble. It was never far off. It didn't take long for me to find the thrills that most teenagers from my generation long for. In the span of about 1 season, my whole lifestyle changed. Though I claim to still believe in God and all the principles of Christianity that I pretended to understand, I somehow allowed myself to be comfortable with the thought that I would find my way back again someday. The more indulgence I took part in, the more of it I craved. In the span of about 1 year, drugs, wild parties, sex, and vandalism became a norm for me. As soon as my mother encountered some of my friends, she immediately suspected the worst of foul play. She threatened to kick me out if I didn't stop smoking pot. So without looking back, I left the house that I grew up in. Not long afterward, I quit my job and things took a turn for the worst. Being young and naive, I embraced the idea of not having a home. And for the next 7 years after that, I never really could consider any place I dwelled as home. Not long after I turned 18, I remember picking up a book off the floor of a friend's bedroom. I didn't think much of it, knowing the kind of person that he was. It was the Satanic Bible. He told me that I should read it. So without resistance, reluctance, and without having much else to do, I spent the next few days reading. I was so intrigued by this book, I decided to read the Necronomicon as well, another book that he possessed. At that point, I was so worn down and jaded by the low points of regret in my life, it didn't faze me to look into these things. I had hit an all-time low and knew that I was going nowhere. I had no hopes or dreams. All I really thought about was when, where, and how I could get high next. I was longing for something to hope and believe in, and the very thought of God at that point was sickening to me. The last thing that I wanted to do was admit that I was wrong and stop doing what I thought was the answer to everything, getting high. When I read these books, I forgot about the way that I felt. I was so depressed, and yet I couldn't seem to figure out why. I forgot about reason and guilt and even feeling sorry for myself when I read these books. I felt like I could use these books to get whatever I wanted. So I began to study them and learn how to carry out some of the ritualistic portions of them. Not long after that, I began to practice such things. And little did I know of what dangers I had exposed myself to. Despite following tedious instructions as best I could, though being high out of my mind on drugs, I never got any positive results from these rituals. What I did get, however, I would be unaware of for still years to come. My relationship with family members quickly waned away after I had proudly exposed and proclaimed myself to be pagan. My mother and stepfather had moved out of the house that I grew up in and had placed it up for rent. At that point, I was working once again and requested to become their tenant. Though my mother was frustrated and heartbroken at the person that I had become, clearly she still loved me because without question, she allowed me to do this. Her housewarming gift to me was a Bible. In an exchange of words, letting me know that she was not going to give up on me or cease praying for me. Not long after moving in, I had decided to have a housewarming party at which I downed a bottle of 150 proof grain alcohol, and without thinking, in a drunken rage, I proceeded to burn this Bible that she gave me and urinate on the ashes. It's not easy for me to think about how I did these things, and it's even more difficult to talk about it. The next day when she came to pick up her mail, she found the remnants of this Bible in the backyard because much of it didn't burn. When I tried to set it on fire, it kept going out. It was almost like it couldn't be destroyed. This broke my mother's heart, and she refused to talk to me for some time after that. And even when we did see each other, the conversation would always become the same debate and take a turn for the worst. I remember just after these things occurred, coming home from work one day, and I'll never forget what I saw. Now, know that I'm not fabricating what I'm about to tell you in any way. At the time, I was terrified and wanted nothing more than pretend like it wasn't there. Just getting home that day, I pulled into the driveway, stepped out of the car, and immediately my attention was drawn upward into the sky. It was a clear summer day. The sun was shining and the sky was blue. However, above the house, and only above my house, was one of the darkest clouds I've ever seen still to this day. It was a low-lying circular cloud, and it was spinning in a vortex with thunder and lightning inside of it. Even though it took everything in me to look away and pretend like I didn't see it, in my heart I knew that a judgment from God had just been poured out on me. Even though I knew that what I had done was wrong, I persisted to go my own way. Granted, that it wasn't long after that I finally put the Satanic Bible down for good. However, even in the decision of doing that, I couldn't bring myself to let go of the Necronomicon. I was so attached to it that I didn't even know how to let go of it. I was afraid to burn it or throw it away. I had a feeling that if I just left it somewhere, something bad would happen to me. So I held on to it, but no longer attempted to practice anything else contained in it. As time went on, I met new friends and left old ones behind. New friends introduced me to new drugs, new music, and new things to influence me. My knowledge of world religions and beliefs expanded. My maturity progressed in some ways and digressed in other ways. I decided to stop being so reckless and focus on the deeper meanings of life. My goal was to find a new state of mind that no one had ever reached before. I figured that if I could do this, I might actually find happiness and feel complete. My outlook on my own self-made religion had changed as well. I had a way of reaching out to people and connecting with them, which in turn made me somewhat of a leader amongst many. I still despised Christianity at this point and made it a habit to foolishly put down believers. I even went out of my way to convert many of them, just as had been done to me. Even though I thought awfully highly of myself, my weakness to drug addiction and poverty was still easily seen. Sort of like the prodigal son from Luke chapter 15 in the Bible. The prodigal son requested for his share of his inheritance from his father, and after obtaining it, he left his father's house. Soon afterwards, he spent all of his inheritance on partying. So he went to work as a servant, feeding swine. He was so hungry that the food he fed to the pigs looked appetizing. But when he thought about why that was, he came to his senses and hurried back to his father's house to beg for forgiveness. The thing that makes me different from the prodigal son is when I looked at the pig food, I decided to go ahead and eat it. Thankfully, someone was still lifting up prayers for me, even at this point of my life, and God had not given up on getting my attention. Another experience that came upon me 3 years after seeing the judgment cloud over my house came late one night in 2004. If I haven't stressed by now how desperately addicted I was to drugs, this story will certainly address the issue. You see, the drug that I had ingested more than any other was marijuana. But when I couldn't get my fix with it, I would turn to harder drugs. And when I couldn't afford or get access to those, I would settle for more desperate measures. I used things that weren't even intended to be ingested into the human body. And on this particular night, I was desperate, so I purchased some cough medicine with the intention of overdosing on it to trip. However, it didn't seem to be working as fast as I wanted it to, so I got even more desperate and proceeded to steal Freon out of an air conditioning unit. I was going to huff it. Again, it's not easy for me to talk about these things. I can't begin to tell you all the incredibly stupid things I did back then. But evidently, everything happens for a reason. As soon as this toxic gas entered my bloodstream, I immediately blacked out. I can't prove that I actually died because there was no instrumentation monitoring my vitals, but I will never forget what happened to me. Immediately after I blacked out, I saw a black downward spiral or wormhole. The blackness engulfed me completely, and the next thing I saw as I opened my eyes was what I believe to be hell. I opened my eyes, and the sight of what was there still completely terrifies me to this day. It was an enormous cavern of sorts, so big that I could not see the walls of its perimeter, only sheer darkness. I was standing on the shore of a great body of liquid fire with the likeness of lava, but reflective. The lake of fire was to the west of me. When I looked to the north, I saw rows of souls, almost like a field of crop ready for harvest, as far as my eyes could see. Almost like literally a field or crop that was white for harvest, only it was too late for this field. This harvest was in vain because these souls were too late to be harvested by the Lord. But I saw these rows of souls, all connected at the arms, without hands. Just one arm attached to each torso on the other side of it. These souls did not possess legs either, save for what could be described as a pillar connecting their torsos to the ground. They did have heads with faces which had terrified expressions upon them. Each soul, because it was connected to the other side, Each soul, because it was connected to one on either side of it by the arm, was pulling back and forth on the others around it, as if to try and flee the terrifying event which was about to take place. Only its effort was in vain, because not only could it not separate itself from the souls around it, but it couldn't move from the ground that it stood upon, being attached to the ground itself by the pillar that held it up. Then I looked up as I heard the horrifying roars above me. I saw a circular opening in the ceiling of this massive cavern. Perched around the ring of the circular opening were what appeared to be demons. I watched as each one in turn would swoop downward from its place of perch to open its jaws and devour each soul, one after the next. This was the most horrifying sight that I have ever witnessed. And immediately at that moment I realized, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly where I was. There was no memory of being in my body, just a few moments beforehand when I decided to huff Freon, while also overdosing on cough medicine. There was no feeling of fiending to get high anymore. All of that was gone. As I saw this happen, I immediately turned to the south and ran. I ran without running. I can't describe what that's like, but it happened. Then immediately I heard a voice and understood why I was there. I felt the condemnation and weight of my transgression bearing down on me. I thought that my life was over. I felt remorse. Then the next thing I knew, I was sucked back through the black spiral and back into my body. I suppose this could have just been a vision, but the reason that it makes me think my spirit actually left my body is because when I came back to, I felt different. I felt like a different person. For the first time in years, I felt the fear of God. I felt many things that I have never spoke of to anyone until after I was saved. After this happened to me, I didn't know what to do. I knew that God was trying to get my attention, but I didn't know what to do about it. I was still too proud to admit my faults, and it didn't take long for Satan to come right back in and puff me back up again. But the one thing he couldn't do is take away the memory of what I experienced that night. I actually had people that knew me well and were with me practically on a daily basis tell me that I even looked different and that my irises and my eyes had a different shape. So for reasons such as that, I believe that I actually left my body. If you read the Old Testament of the Bible, it doesn't take much time to see some of the characteristics of God. For example, the way that He issues judgment. When God releases judgment, yes, it's powerful and terrifying. But that is for a great reason. For those of us who have or had a hard heart, against God's love toward us, He must possess some sort of mechanism to break that hardness. Otherwise, how could He reach us? Therefore, God will only release judgment out of love, and when He does, it's always followed by mercy. Look it up in the Old Testament, and you'll see what I mean. Don't get God's judgment confused with His wrath. Those are two different things. Psalm 19:10 says that God's judgment are to be desired more than gold. I would love to tell you that it ended there. But no, I persisted, and Satan had me convinced that everything I experienced that night was just a hallucination and meant nothing. Obviously, knowing what I know now, I can recognize that strategy that he will always use when the Lord is trying to tell us something. This entire memory makes me think about Matthew 12:43 through 45, when Jesus speaks of an unclean spirit returning. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came, and when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. As time went on, so did I. At that point in my life, I was already starting to recognize God's movement therein, and it totally made me feel uncomfortable. I would go through seasons of being content and happy in my sin, eating, drinking, and being merry, so to speak. And then in other seasons, I would feel the same heavy weight of depression and loneliness, wanting more but not knowing how to get it, wanting to be free from chains of bondage and not knowing where to begin. And still the believers continued to pray over me. The years passed by, and I continued to feed my addictions. I moved in and out of bad relationships, mistaking certain people, books, music, and drugs for having the solution to all my problems. I started using psychedelic drugs more frequently and mixing painkillers with alcohol. I recall one season just after my father passed away, having an extremely bad episode with alcohol, drinking almost every day to the point of blacking out. I remember getting belligerently drunk and picking fights with people, even my friends. In February of 2008, I got the news that I was going to be a father. At this point, I had briefly gotten off of all the drugs and alcohol and traveled to Kentucky to the Job Corps program. That was where I got the phone call from Logan's mother letting me know that we were going to be parents later that year. Regretfully, I didn't stay in the program, but instead decided to come back home to Georgia. Logan's mother and I realized things would never work between us well before he was born. And there was quite a bit of hostility there. The summer of 2008 was a pretty reckless summer for me as well. After having a failed relationship and knowing that I was going to be responsible for a baby, I was pretty upset and down-stricken by the whole situation. She went into labor and gave birth on October 22nd, and I wasn't even there to see my son's first glimpse at the world or hear his first cries, all because of selfishness. During the summer of 2008, I started to dabble more into paganism. However, this time I went in a different direction and began to study more about Wicca and wizardry. I read several books on the subject and began to celebrate the sacred days of the year. I also came in contact with a connection for psilocybin mushrooms and began to eat them. I had had positive experiences in the past with using them. However, I had obviously opened the door and allowed something to get in and have access to oppress me. The following year is when things really began to get wound up in my life. I finally got to the point of making peace with my family, and we began to spend more time together. Apologies were made on both sides. Still, I persisted to push my beliefs into their faces in what I thought was a constructively creative way. I started to embrace the idea that perhaps Christianity was legitimate, but just not for everyone, including me. I tried to express the correlation in all belief systems and therefore find a common ground where I could be accepted within my family and somehow get them to stop praying for me. I noticed that every time I went around my mother, I would feel uneasy and uncomfortable. It was almost like every time she prayed, it would stir up the condemnation within me, and I remember it driving me crazy. And it got to the point that every time I used drugs, I found that the euphoric feeling was no longer there. And I just felt miserable, and I had several anxiety attacks. I ended up in a relationship that would result in the change of everything before it was ended. I met a friend of a friend one day, and we ended up liking each other, which was very convenient for me at the time. After all, I had nowhere to go, and it just happened that her family were Christians. The house that her and her mother lived in was foreclosed, and they ended up moving in with her grandparents. I went over to their house and met them both. They were very nice people and didn't judge me for who I was. They actually allowed me to stay there in their home with my girlfriend at the time. They actually let me stay at their home with my girlfriend during that time when her and her mother lived there. This really blew my mind and was one of the factors that changed my heart about Christians. Turns out we're not all judgmental, even to the lowest of lows. Looking back on that final 6 months in the year of 2009, things were different. I experienced and received unconditional love for the first time from people that I hadn't even known for very long. I actually felt appreciated for the first time in almost a decade. I actually felt peaceful at some points. However, old habits die hard. I had come to develop a standard for the way that I treated people, even people that I didn't agree with. On the outside, I seemed a fun and loving character. However, on the inside was an imminent wrecking ball. Now that I had a place to stay, instead of having to run for shelter, I had more of a chance to develop some sort of attempt to understand why I had so much pain inside of me and why I felt so oppressed. But the harder I tried to wrestle these feelings and smother them with drugs, the worse they became. And the more I dabbled in the occult to try to get things under control, the worse they became. I thought that if I could humble myself and love everyone, that I could earn acceptance and save myself while still doing pretty much anything else I wanted to do. I remember celebrating my son's first birthday on October 22nd of 2009 and having a conversation with my sister who had found salvation only a few years prior to that point. I told her that I could see a difference in her and I could tell that she was definitely happy. I told her that I wanted to be happy. As soon as I said that, I felt something in my heart break, and I started to well up inside. I had no idea why that was happening at the time. I know now that was Jesus tugging on my heart, pleading for me to let him in before it was too late. I wasted the opportunity, however, and let pride stand in my way. It wouldn't be until 2 months later, at the end of 2009, that the dam broke open. A couple of days before New Year's Eve in 2009, something happened that changed my life. I had planned on going to a New Year's Eve party and wanted something different to make things interesting. So I invested in a bag of mushrooms and ended up eating 5 grams in one sitting. My ex-girlfriend and I were at a friend's house. When they started to kick in, I had hoped for a good trip, but knew that things could go sour, so I was preparing myself. I just want to say that people will take these things thinking that they are safe because they are natural and grow in nature. But there is a whole other aspect of danger when dealing with these things, whether people choose to realize it or not. There's something about psilocybin that has the ability to expose you to the spiritual dimension and therefore leave you vulnerable to things that you have no control over. That's why some people lose it and go off their rockers and kill people when on these types of drugs. Knowing what had happened in the past, out of denial, I chose to take these, and when I did, all hell broke loose. I remember hallucinating in our friend's house and just telling myself that it was only a trip and wasn't actually happening. I managed to keep myself calm until we left and I started to beg her to take me to our home. I remember my vision trying to go two-dimensional and trying to fight it. I felt that if I allowed this to happen, then something was going to take over me and I would no longer be myself. That's a horrifying feeling that words can't describe. As time went on, it got worse. She was driving as fast as she could to get us home, but as I looked out the windows of the car, I kept seeing the same land over and over again, like we just kept driving over the same spot repeatedly and weren't getting anywhere. I actually had to ask her if she was seeing that and if we were actually getting anywhere. We finally made it to the house and just in time. The entire time we were driving in the car, a voice inside of me kept telling me that if I could just get home, I would be fine. When we arrived, I ran into the house and into our bedroom. That's where all of my books and seals and protective things were. So I thought that was why I needed to be at home. Upon the wall of our bedroom, I had hung several paintings from several artists, one of which was Alex Grey. He made several paintings of different deities. One was the pagan goddess. I had hung that painting on the wall and went over to it to pray, but when I tried to ask for help, all I could hear in my head was laughter. I kept telling her that I wasn't okay and I wouldn't be okay ever again. I've never been that scared before in my entire life. And I just want to say that, of course, if you put all of your faith and all of your emotion, if you contribute it to a deity, a false deity, thinking that it will protect you, thinking that it will benefit you, and then in a real time of need, you turn to that thing and it fails you. Not only does it fail you, but it mocks you and laughs at you and lets you know that it has taken and robbed your very soul from the inside of you, and it has you for its possession. It's a terrifying feeling. So I didn't think that I would be okay ever again. I've never been that scared before in my entire life. The only words I could use to describe it is like falling over the edge of an abyss and knowing that it's over and your life is done. Because there's nothing left to live. I knew that even if I weren't going to be devoured by some demon, that I would never be the same again, and would probably end up in a straitjacket in a padded room. I finally gave up trying to pray to a painting when my eyes drifted off of it and onto another painting that I had tacked up. It was another one of Alex Gray's works. It was his painting of Christ. Yes, I had also put that one on my wall as well. I remember the day that I did that, and when I decided to put Christ on my wall, I told myself that it was only because it was Alex Gray's work and I respected him as an artist. I stared intently at it. The eyes like fire. As I looked into the eyes of Jesus, something happened to me. I felt it. When I tried to look away, all of the darkness would come rushing back in. But when I stared at Jesus, I felt the same feeling that I felt the day I had spoken to my sister only a couple of months earlier. I had peace. I finally had the realization of Jesus Christ as the Savior. Those who can relate know what I'm talking about. When you realize that He really is who He says He is, at that point I couldn't look away, because I felt Him in my heart. When all the demonic darkness that had tried to take my soul from the beginning was close, close enough to destroy me forever, Jesus showed up. This terrified me even more, however. I thought to myself, oh no, what have I done? He's real, and I am too late. He's the answer to everything that I've been asking for, searching for, trying to get to, and now I'm too late. I was so scared that that was going to be my last night on earth. And I guess in a way it was, because I've never been the same since that night. Well, time went by. Half an hour passed and I was okay. 2 hours passed and I was still part of reality. The night came and went, and the next day as well. Even New Year's came and went. I was now a believer and proclaimed that to myself. I just wasn't sure what to do next. It was before I had a revelation of God's grace. So I continued to live life, but I refused to leave the house that week. And on the Saturday of that weekend, I began to start questioning yet again. I went to the gas station, picked up a 6-pack, brought it home, and started drinking and playing video games. That's when I started to feel the same anxiety feeling come over me again. So I got up and said, "That's it." I called my mother and told her that I wanted to come over so she could pray with me. My ex and I drove over to her house, and I remember walking up the driveway. By the time I got to the front porch, it felt like I had a 1,000-pound weight on my back. As soon as I stepped into the door, I fell on my face and cried out to God for forgiveness. Even after that, I still didn't understand the terms or conditions and felt powerless against sin. I knew that I didn't want to continue in my ways, so I agreed to go with my mother to the church the next day, the same church that I had walked out of nearly 10 years before. As I walked into the sanctuary that Sunday and walked up the aisles to the front, I felt everyone's eyes upon me, but I was only there for one reason. It only took 10 minutes of being there. And within those 10 minutes, 10 years of condemnation, guilt and shame, and brokenness left me that day. I was born again on January 3rd, 2010. God's grace entered into my life, and I've never been the same. You're looking at a face that has seen it all, tried it all, and for the grace and mercy of our Lord still stands here today to remind you that if God can save a wretch like me, He can do anything. I am now nearly 5 years strong in the Lord, and I'm still growing. My God has brought me a beautiful wife, 2 wonderful children, and more love and compassion than I can even account for. So if you or someone you love is fighting for their salvation and looking for the answer, do not lose heart. And do not cease in the lifting of prayers for those who are lost. God will make a way if you choose to believe His word and stand upon the rock of salvation. People, I'm living proof that God loves us all, even those who go out of their way to put Him down and curse Him and run from Him and despise Him. I was one of those people, the lowest of lows. At one point in my life, I was willing to do anything but turn to the truth. And this entire time, God chased me, chased after me. He wanted me back. You see, in the Bible, it clearly says that God has set all times for their appointed place from before the creation of the world. He knew who we would be. Before He created the earth, He knew exactly who each one of us would be. We came from Him. He knew where I would go in my life. He knew the things that I would see. He knew the choices that I would make. And He didn't give up on me. So I'm just here to tell you, number one, to praise God for that very reason, for who He is, and the fact that He doesn't just have love, He is love. He's the author of love. Love is a part of God. That's where it comes from. But I'm also here to say that regardless of who might be lost, what they may have done, if it's you, what you may have done in the past, if it's someone you know, whatever they could have done, whatever you could have done, don't lose heart and believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior of all flesh, and you will be saved. They will be saved. Do not cease in praying for the lost, for it is the prayers and the faith to God that move him into acting upon these situations. And he knew exactly what I needed to experience so that my heart would be changed into following him. And I'm such a different person today than I was back then that you wouldn't recognize me. But I thank you for watching this, my testimony. I ask that if you will share this in whatever way you want to. If you're inspired to share this story, go ahead and share it. Share it online, share this video, share it through talking to people. But remind Christians, other Christians, remind them that nothing is impossible with God. I'm living proof. But thank you again for watching this video. Have a great day. God bless you all.